Tom Frezza here with the Naval History and Heritage Command, and today we are going to be cooking with history. The recipe that we're actually going to be using comes out of the 1945 edition of the U.S. Navy Cookbook, and it is going to be for cinnamon buns. Alright, so the recipe itself, the portions, again, as with all of the recipes in here, are for 100 portions. And a portion for the recipe is 2 buns apiece. So we've definitely scaled down the recipe. And the reason why we're doing cinnamon buns is because, one, it's a good dessert, but it's also a very good breakfast. But it's also one of those things that we can look at bakeries aboard vessels during World War II. A lot of the larger vessels did have their own bakeries where they would put out breads and cakes and also cinnamon buns. And this recipe actually uses up 2 recipes in the book. One of them is for baking powder biscuits, and the other recipe is for the quick cinnamon buns. So, the ingredients for the baking powder biscuits: you need dough, which is made out of flour, which the original recipe calls for 14 pounds of flour. We're not going to be using that. But we will be using 4 cups of flour. It also calls for baking powder, which the original calls for 1.5 cups. We'll be using 2 teaspoons. Salt, the original recipe calls for 5 tablespoons. We'll be using 1/2 teaspoon. Shortening, 1 3/4 quarts of shortening. We'll be using 1/2 cup. And let's see here, milk, which calls for 1 3/8 gallons. We'll be using 5 tablespoons. Now, the rest of the recipe comes from the quick cinnamon bun side of the house. The sugar and spice mix, which will go onto the dough and then rolled up into it, calls for sugar, which the original calls for 1.5 pints of sugar. We'll be using 6 tablespoons. Salt, 1 tablespoon in the original recipe. We'll be using 1/2 teaspoon. Cinnamon, 2 tablespoons in the original recipe, and in the scaled down version, 1.5 teaspoons. And then shortening, melted, 3.5 cups in the original recipe. We're going to be using 7 tablespoons. And then there's a sugar glaze mix that actually goes into the bottom of the pan. The original recipe calls for sugar, 1.5 quarts. We'll be using 3/4 of a cup. Water, the original calls for 1.5 pints. We'll be using 6 tablespoons. And shortening, melted, 1 1/4 cups. In the original recipe, we'll be using 1/2 tablespoon. So, the way this is going to work is for the dough, they want you to mix all of the flour, the baking powder, salt, shortening, and milk together to make the dough. And then you will roll out the biscuit dough into a rectangular piece about 12 inches wide and 1/4 of an inch thick. You'll spread on sugar, salt, cinnamon, and shortening, that sugar and spice mix, onto the dough. And then you'll roll it as for a jelly roll, basically a spiral roll. Cut into 1-inch slices. Spread the shortening, water, and sugar mixture onto the bottom of the sheet pan, that sugar glaze mix that I was talking about. And then you'll place the rolls the cut side down, meaning that as you look down into the pan, you'll see the spiral. You'll bake all of that at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for about 25 to 30 minutes, or basically until it becomes a golden brownish color. And then you'll remove the rolls from the pan at once. Alright, for serving, they want you to serve it warm. So we're going to try that out and see how it turns out. Alright, so here's the final product. As you can see, our cinnamon buns. I did have to do some adjustment to the recipe for the dough. It called for 5 tablespoons of milk. You're going to need a little bit more liquid than that. It's always good to eyeball it, but all of the other measurements stayed the same. And I added some almonds into the mix as well, as you can kind of see them on the buns. So we'll we'll cut one of these out and see how it looks. It smells amazing, and it's too bad that there's no smell-o-vision. But we'll get one of these out, and it looks like the sugar that you put into the bottom just gets absorbed up and into the bun itself. That looks really good, and we have it in our World War I mess kit right here. All right, so there you have it, the cinnamon roll recipe out of the 1945 edition of the U.S. Navy Cookbook. I'm going to sit down and enjoy this, but if you're looking for more information, please visit the website of the Naval History and Heritage Command, history.navy.mil, and we'll see you at our next cooking lesson.